What is up, health enthusiasts? It's Coach Lamby here with Working Weights LLC, your guide to health, strength, and all things nutrition. I am joined, as always, by my co-host, Dwayne Ulrich, aka Poppy Doral. And we are joined by a special guest today, and we are going to talk about some plant-based science. And unfortunately, I lost my stuff for my teleprompter, so I have to read this off the screen.
Oh my gosh.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, on today's podcast, we have the pleasure of hosting a brilliant mind in the realm of nutrition and sustainable living. Meet Patrick Elliott, a dedicated PhD student at University College Dublin, where he delves into the intricate web of human nutrition with a special focus on the health and environmental impacts of sustainable diets. Armed with a bachelor's in sports science and health from Dublin City University and a master's degree in public health nutrition, Patrick is not just a scholar, he is a holistic thinker. His research isn't confined to the academic corridors alone. Patrick has made significant contributions to our understanding of plant-based diets and their effects on cardiometabolic health, showcasing his commitment to bridging the gap between theory and practical well-being. But that's not all. Patrick wears multiple hats. As the Health and Nutrition Science Communication Officer at Training 1-to-1, he goes beyond the confines of academia, sharing his wealth of knowledge in the wider community. You might have come across his insightful weekly articles on nutrition and exercise science, where he breaks down complex topics into digestible nuggets of wisdom. So whether you're passionate about sustainable living, curious about the impacts of your diet on your health, or just eager to explore the intersection of science and communication, you're in for a treat. So without further ado, let's welcome Patrick Elliott to the podcast. Patrick, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That was flattering to say the least, and I think you exaggerated a few details there, but I'll take it.
Okay. Very good. Dwayne, how are you today?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good. Super excited to hear what Patrick has to say.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try my best to follow along with the abbreviations.
I'm excited to learn something. So Patrick, I gave you a short introduction, but maybe you can give us a little bit of history about what got you into the realm of nutrition. Why did you want to go to the schooling and get the formal education and brought you to the point that you're at?
Yeah, so I think the path has been meandering. It hasn't always had a singular, I suppose, outcome in mind or focus, but I originally left, I suppose, high school and I didn't know what I wanted to do. So I actually went to university and did English and ancient classics and German. And then realized
I'm
I
German.
didn't. Oh, right. Okay. I realized I didn't want to go down that route. So I dropped out actually, and then took some time to think about what I wanted to do and ended up deciding on sports science because I was a good runner and I had an interest in exercise and that sort of thing. So went down that route, did a bachelor's in sports science. I think probably in my second year, I started to get interested in nutrition. So we had some modules on sports nutrition, on some kind of general like clinical nutrition stuff as well. And also, my dad at the time had a heart attack, and I just kind of got interested in looking at like cardiovascular disease in particular, as a result of that. So in third year of my undergrad, I got to go to Washington D.C. and I did an internship with a place there, and I had the opportunity to work in a clinical trial, looking at actually a vegan diet versus a Mediterranean diet crossover study, and then did my undergraduate thesis on nutrition. So then after that, COVID hit, and I knew I wanted to go on and do more study, but I kind of took a year because I didn't want to do it all online. I wanted to be in the university. So the following year, then I went and did a master's in public health nutrition in UCD, and then it was through my master's I got to work on some of the stuff we're going to talk about today, which is the plant-based diets and cardiometabolic disease, and some of the papers that came from the master's we'll talk about today. And then currently now I am doing a PhD in UCD as well. So that's University College Dublin. And my PhD is focused on sustainable diets. So we're trying to figure out ways to shift people to eat more sustainable diets and understand the effects of sustainable diets on health as well.
Yeah, that's great. I think yeah, we definitely need more information out there on sustainable diets. I think what's available to everybody is it's these really hard crash diets that are very, very constrictive or restrictive in nature. And we see a lot of people failing to lose weight, but then they can't sustain the diet and they regain weight. So I think what you're doing is fantastic. It's definitely needed.
I will say as well the sustainable aspect. So there's like this food, the FAO, so the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations and the World Health Organization, they conceptualize sustainable diets as like diets that promote health and promote environmental health, and then also are, you know, socioeconomically and socioculturally acceptable. So they
Mhm.
kind of cover a lot of bases. So they're kind of like diets that, again, as I said, promote well as personal health while also being acceptable to people in other domains as well. So they kind of it
Yeah,
covers a lot.
yeah, that's great. That's I'm kind of working on the same thing here as I transition from Houston to Arizona. The population up here is more predominantly Native American. Well, maybe not more predominantly, but there are more Native Americans here than there are in Houston, at least. And they do make a large proportion of it. And so I'm trying to work on specific foods or food groups or introducing different ingredients into what would be a culturally appropriate diet for them. So I'm excited to uh, see some of that work in the future and learn from it and how I can put that into practice into my own coaching practice. So that's good. Yeah, so Patrick, we kind of got introduced in a Facebook group. We talked about it last week on the podcast, Alinea Nutrition. And Patrick shared a paper that he was involved in, and we are going to go over that today. And I think it's fantastic to have someone who's actually involved in the research be able to explain the research rather than having someone like me who's giving my interpretation of the research when I wasn't there. And I always learn so much more when you hear an interview or you read an interview from someone who is involved in the project, and you may have taken away something from the text, and then you hear the interview and you're like, oh, okay, that's why they did this thing, and now you have a different understanding of it. So I think this is much better, and I hope to have many more people involved in research on the podcast. So I'm going to share the screen here.
Oh yeah. I took a deep dive. This is the one I took a big deep dive off in, Patrick.
Yeah, so this is the one. So this paper titled Plant-Based Diet Indices and Lipoprotein Particle Subclass Profiles, a cross-sectional analysis of
Bitter.
what is happening today? Middle to older aged adults. Uh,
It is a mouthful, in
it is
fairness.
a mouthful. The titles are always a mouthful. All right, so the first thing we'll see is that Patrick's name is first in the
Yeah.
in the list of names here. So Patrick, maybe you can tell us what does it mean that your name is first on this paper? And kind of just give the audience an understanding of the order of names here and the relevance to it.
Yeah, so first authorship means that you conducted the majority of the analysis, you wrote the paper, you wrote the first draft. It's essentially your baby. And you did the last name then would be the supervisor. And this is field specific. So in most fields it's like that, but in some fields, like I think in potentially computer science or other areas, I know that they actually the ordering of the name is, it doesn't correspond to the way that we do it. But generally
Hmm.
speaking, for science articles in health and biomedicine and that sort of thing, it's like that. So first authorship would be the person who principally did most of the stuff. The last author would be the supervisor who supervises throughout each step of the way, make sure that it's on track. And then some other authors, the co-authors in the middle, they provide specific input at certain points. So for example, James Offos here, Jim Offos, he's an expert in lipoproteins. So he actually developed the methodology to look at lipoprotein profiles with the specific technology that's used in this study. So it was his company that actually looked at the variables that I looked at in this study for this. And then also I had some correspondence with him. I had a few questions over a number of things, and he helped, and then he helped. He read over the paper as well. So that's why he's a co-author. He had an intellectual input to the paper. So you have to have an intellectual input to it to get as a co-author, essentially.
Ah, interesting. Okay. So if I was to cite this, let's say I wrote an article and I was to cite this paper, whose name would I put?
You put my name, so
Put your
my
name.
second name. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Wow. Yeah. So let's take a look at this. So maybe you just want to tell us an overview of what this research project was about, why you guys did it, how is this relevant, all that stuff.
So previous research, throughout the last few decades, or a couple of decades really, has shown that people who eat vegan and vegetarian diets tend to have a lower risk of certain chronic diseases versus non-vegetarians. And there's some meta-analyses that have looked at that, and the most recent one was actually published this year in the European Journal of Nutrition, that show that when you kind of combine these studies looking at vegans and vegetarians versus non-vegetarians, you tend to see a lower risk in cardiovascular disease anyway, particularly coronary heart disease. But the thing about looking at that is, number one, there's not many vegans and vegetarians in the population, so it's hard to do studies on vegans and vegetarians versus non-vegetarians to see what kind of plant-based diets look like versus non-vegetarian diets. But also it doesn't discriminate by the quality of the food, so the healthfulness of the plant foods in the diet. You can be vegan and eat Oreos and Coke.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to, it's not necessarily a healthy dietary pattern. It depends on what you're eating and what you're not eating, etc. So to get kind of around this issue, or these two issues, researchers in Harvard, they developed the plant-based diet indices. So these are what are called diet scores. So they're numeric scoring systems that classify a diet by its quality. Okay, so what you do is you put certain numbers on different food groups, and if people eat more of one food group, they score higher. If they eat less of it, they score less, and then all together you get this one number that gives an individual's score, to show how high quality or low quality it is. So that's the kind of the idea for using diet scores, is to get an idea of a dietary pattern in a population. And then with the plant-based diet indices, that those who score high aren't necessarily vegan or vegetarian. So you can apply this score in any cohort, and you can stratify by those who eat more plant-based and those who eat less plant-based. But it's not a binary vegan versus non-vegan or vegetarian versus non-vegetarian. It allows for diet quality, and specifically for plant-based diet quality, to be assessed in pretty much any cohort. So that's the advantage of looking at dietary pattern analysis using diet scores in different studies. And then, when the Harvard guys first published this, it was quite landmark. It was quite groundbreaking at the time. The first paper that came from that group, and the first author is Ambika Satija. So this was from her PhD thesis. These scores, that was her PhD. And in 2016, they saw that those who ate a more healthy plant-based diet, so this was the HPDI index that we'll get to, they had a 34% reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, versus those who scored very low. So that was in the top decile, so the top kind of 10th of the population versus the bottom 10th. And they also saw then on the flip side that those who ate a more unhealthy plant-based diet had a 16% greater risk of type 2 diabetes. So you see this divergence in the direction of associations, even though those in the unhealthy plant-based diet index, they were eating a plant-based diet or a more plant-based diet, but because it was based on less healthy plant foods, not your fruits and vegetables, you're more like your refined grains and sugar sweetened beverages and that sort of thing, they actually had an increased risk, even though they had low amount of animal foods in the diet. So it just gives you more context, essentially, for looking at associations. And then we decided, so there's been that was the first kind of paper. They published again in 20.
Can I stop and ask a question? So does the development of these indices So I think maybe like a pushback from the opposite side of the nutrition spectrum would be that we're seeing these lower rates of cardiovascular disease in more vegan and vegetarian diets. And so the pushback on that would be like, well, people who tend to eat more plants tend to be healthier individuals in general. So you have the healthy user bias example, or argument, right? It's the healthy user bias. But the development of these indices would basically give the answer to that healthy user bias. Am I understanding that correct?
Somewhat. So to the first point, yes. People who eat vegetarian sometimes or oftentimes they have other health promoting behaviors. So if you're crudely looking at health outcomes versus vegetarian versus non-vegetarian, you might know what's really driving the reduced risk. But to that first point, in those prospective cohort studies where they do look at that, they do try and adjust. So they adjust for the confounding factors, so physical activity, education, age, and sex, and that sort of thing, to try and hold those factors constant, so they can see an independent effect. But to your second point, yeah, the diet indices, the plant-based diet indices, they allow for a more plant-based diet versus less, if you know a comparison there. But those in the high group, depending on the population, those in the high group might not be eating like super plant-based. It might be just a bit more than those in the lower group. So you're not actually looking at a type of people that might have other health promoting behaviors. But also in the statistical analysis, you can and you should adjust for other potential confounding variables anyway. So like in our paper here, we adjusted for age and sex and education and physical activity and type 2 diabetes status and some other things, to try and find an independent association between the diet score and the diet, and then these outcomes that we'll get onto. So yeah, but you are correct in what you say, that when you're not looking at a binary vegan versus non-vegan, and it's more just a homogenous, similar population of people, you can kind of get around some of them issues.
Okay.
I have a question, if you guys don't mind. So when you guys are doing your analysis and you're looking at your data group, did you find that people who announce that they take I'm a vegan or a vegetarian lifestyle, and that the people that are out there that are eating plant-based foods predominantly, and then but on the side they're also eating Oreos, like you said a minute ago, do you find that that's a mentality of theirs? It's like, well, I'm eating really good, so I can cheat on them with an Oreo, or this is okay because I eat a vegetarian diet? Does that question make sense? Did you find that as a mindset?
Well, I actually haven't done research specifically with vegan or vegetarian populations, because this study was looking at omnivores, and then they were class versus more plant-based versus less plant-based.
Okay.
But that is a thing you do hear colloquially. So you do hear people think, oh, I'm eating vegan, so therefore, like, even if I eat kind of a shittier vegan diet, it's still better than eating like a more animal-based diet. And to be honest with you, these diet scores have shown that that's not necessarily true, because we see time and time again that those who eat more unhealthful plant-based dietary patterns, which is higher scores of the UPDI scores in that I use in this study, and in other studies, we see that those people tend to do worse for outcomes like cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, versus those eating more animal foods but also more healthy plant foods. So it's been really, really enlightening. These scores have been a real addition to the evidence base, and that consideration of plant-based diet quality is super important, particularly when we're talking about eating more plant foods for environmental health. It's important we don't sacrifice human health as well. So it's super, super important.
Wow. Okay, cool.
So let me see if I can recap on the scores here. The score is a number-based kind of point system, let's say from 0 to 100. And we have a general plant-based score. And so the closer you get to 100, the more plant-based that you are eating. And then we have these other two scores. One would be healthy, one would be unhealthy. And so the higher you rank on the healthy plant-based score. We'll get into the specific foods and everything. Would be less risk for certain diseases. And the higher you rank on the unhealthy plant-based score, the more risk you have for those. Is that correct?
That's what the literature has shown to this date.
Okay, very good. All right. So we probably derailed your train of thought there, but anything else about the general overview?
Yeah, so as I've mentioned, we've seen these previous studies in large populations where those who eat, as you said, higher on the healthy plant-based diet index, they do better for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and other outcomes like obesity than those on the lower end. And we've also seen the opposite for the unhealthful plant-based diet index, whereas those who eat on the high end of that have increased risk for these chronic diseases versus those who eat in the low end. So we were like, okay, well, we've seen this, but we haven't actually done. There's not been a lot of research on the mechanisms. So why is this the case? So that was the rationale for looking at what we did, was that okay, we've seen these associations in other studies. Let's see if we can get down to the biomarker level, and let's see how these plant-based diet indices associate with different biomarkers that might actually give us more context as to why we saw these earlier reductions in risk for the healthy plant-based diet index or increases in risk for the unhealthy plant-based diet index.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the kind of the purpose of this study, would you say, would be to, I guess, just as you said, is to look at the blood markers, for a lack of a better word here, and things that we know are related to certain disease outcomes, and then that correlation with the diet score.
Yeah, precisely.
Okay, very good. All right, so yeah, so what'd you guys find?
Yeah, so what we found was kind of a mirroring of the other research just on the mechanism level, so on the blood marker level. What an interesting finding was that the overall plant-based diet index, so that was the one where if you score higher, it doesn't matter what type of plant food you're eating like all the plant foods, so it doesn't discriminate between healthy or unhealthy plant foods. If you're eating higher on that level versus lower, we actually didn't see much of an association either way. So it didn't seem to be protective, and it didn't seem to be, negative either. But so that was an interesting finding. But then when we looked at the healthful plant-based diet index, we saw essentially associations between biomarkers that represent a more favorable, more healthy, more cardiometabolically healthy lipid and lipoprotein profile. So we can go into those markers in a second. And then on the other hand, we saw the opposite with the unhealthy or the unhealthful plant-based diet index. And what was interesting with those findings was they were actually more robust and there was more of them. So we saw like those who ate higher on the unhealthful plant-based diet index versus those who ate lower, they really had a lot of associations with I suppose you'd call unhealthy or cardiometabolically unhealthy biomarker profiles. So again, it kind of highlights the idea that eating a plant-based diet is not necessarily healthy if what you're eating is a lot of sugar sweetened beverages, refined grains, that sort
Oreos.
of thing. Yes, Oreos.
Oreos. So yeah,
yeah.
let's talk about those lipoprotein markers. So before we started recording, Dwayne was saying how he was getting lost in the abbreviations of everything. So if you want to explain all of that stuff, and maybe elucidate us to what those are and what you found. So,
elucidate.
Word of the
Well,
day.
I'm sorry.
It's so it's there's a lot. We looked at a lot of different markers. There's two classes of markers that we looked at, so I'll go through each of them quickly. There's a lot of detail I could go through. I'll try and keep it as easy to understand as I can, because there is a lot in these particular markers, and you can go down all sorts of routes explaining it. But anyway, there's essentially two groups of markers. The first group was what we call lipids. So this is like your cholesterol levels, so your total cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol, which is some people say is the quote unquote bad cholesterol, and then your non-HDL cholesterol, which is your total cholesterol minus your HDL cholesterol, which people call the quote unquote good cholesterol. I don't know if we want to go into that good versus bad dichotomy, but we can. And then also triglycerides. So these are the markers that if you go to your doctor and you get a standard blood test and a lipid panel, these are the markers you're going to get back. So the reason why we looked at these is number one, because when you go and get a standard blood panel, these are the ones that come back. But also number two, because these markers have been shown throughout decades to associate with cardiovascular disease. But so that was the rationale for looking at them. And then the other group, the second group of markers that we looked at are called lipoproteins. So if you think of the first group, the lipids, as fats, so lipids are fats, the lipoproteins are these protein molecules that the fats sit inside that lets them be transported around our body. Because if for example, if you to get cholesterol through our blood is mostly water. So what we need to do is to put that fat into something that can go in the water, because if you, for example, pour olive oil into water, it doesn't mix. So it's not soluble in water. So what our body has designed is essentially these little vehicles called lipoproteins. They keep the cholesterol and the triglycerides, the other lipids in them, and then they can be transported throughout the body. So that's what lipoproteins are. There are different types. They can be broadly characterized as those that can get stuck in our arteries and cause plaque, and those that cannot. So the distinguishing factor between those that can get stuck in our arteries and those that cannot is the presence of a little protein on the edge of the lipoprotein, and that's called ApoB. That's apolipoprotein B. So that's essentially like a key that lets the lipoprotein get into the artery wall, and then it can get stuck there. Whereas the other type of lipoproteins that do not get stuck in the wall, they're called HDLs, and they do not have an ApoB. So that's a kind of very broad difference between them. And I don't know if you want me to go through each class, and kind of go through like why we have different types.
Yeah, I mean, let's go into that, because so I'm going to link this, and I'm also going to link my annotated version here. And we were also talking beforehand about how all the outcomes that you had, and I think that this is one of the most annotated papers that I have that I have done.
Cow.
So much information out of this thing. It was really, really fun to read. So yeah, let's talk about the different LDLs. So I think that's probably, these are a hot topic on the internet today, and we definitely have this division between plant-based and animal-based diets. And so let's talk about what you guys found, kind of the breakdown between all of these different LDL particles, and what makes their association with cardiovascular disease or other types of diseases relevant.
Yeah, so what we found essentially was, for the Healthful Plant-Based Diet Index, we saw, we didn't actually see any associations with LDL specifically, but what we saw was some changes in lipoproteins that indicated insulin resistance, or a reduction in insulin resistance. So essentially those on eating more of healthful plant foods, they had reductions in insulin resistance, and we calculated a score, lipoprotein insulin resistance index score, which is essentially, it takes some of these lipoproteins, puts them together into a score, and it associates with insulin resistance. So that's what we saw on the healthful side. On the unhealthful side, we saw a lot more results. If you go to the graphical abstract of the study, you can see that there's a figure there with all the results plotted together. And what we saw again was an increase in insulin resistance, because a lot of these different lipoproteins that were significantly associated with those eating a more unhealthy plant-based diet index, they associate again with insulin resistance. But also what we saw more of these atherogenic particles. So these are the particles that can get in to the artery wall, and they can cause plaque. So that's your LDL. LDL is the majority of them, but also there's VLDL, which is another type of lipoprotein, and there's also IDL. But generally speaking, when we're talking about those particles that can get stuck in the artery, we're generally talking about LDL, because of all of them particles, 90% in our blood are LDL. But the name that so we actually calculated 100% of them, so the LDL plus the others, and that's called total non-HDL in the paper, and that was significantly associated with those eating a more unhealthy plant-based diet. So the takeaway from that is that if you are eating, well, particularly this is just one study, we can't make huge claims from it, and it's a cross-sectional study, but those eating a more unhealthy plant-based diet had more of these particles in their blood that can get stuck in the artery wall, and they also had increased insulin resistance. So if you put all that together, it's an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, and it's an increased risk for type 2 diabetes. So that's the kind of, I suppose, bottom line from this paper, is that we found the mechanisms, we found associations with the mechanisms that actually gives us more insight into the previous research showing increased risk for those eating unhealthy plant-based diets.
Yeah. Okay. So now you said that this is cross-sectional study. So for the listeners who don't understand what a cross-sectional study is, maybe, would you want to explain that?
Yeah. So cross-sectional, what that means is that we took people in. So I didn't conduct this study. This particular study was done in 2010, but I had access to the data. But what happened was the investigators recruited people. They brought them in. They gave them a questionnaire. It's called a food frequency questionnaire, and that measures their diet, their habitual diet, what they tend to eat generally. And then they took their bloods at the same time. So what you're getting is a snapshot of that person's diet and a snapshot of their bloods at that particular point in time. So the thing about a cross-sectional study is it's good for some things. It's good for understanding prevalence. So, for example, countries like in the US, the NHANES study, they're cross-sectional studies that look at people's diets at one point in time, and they're very useful for seeing how people eat at a particular time, and then they repeat it, the next year and the next year, and they try and see trends in how people eat, right? So that's the benefit of a cross-sectional study. You get to see a snapshot at one period in time. But what you can't do from a cross-sectional study is say that, okay, I looked at their diet, I looked at their bloods, I saw these correlations. Now I'm going to say that diet caused that correlation or that change in the or that biomarker, because you don't have a time series. In order to make a causal inference, you need to have a time series. So you need to see that the exposure, which will be the diet, comes before the outcome, which is the change in the marker, or in the case of cardiovascular disease, it will be the actual event. So that's the limitation of cross-sectional studies, is they don't have that temporal time aspect.
That's where prospective cohort studies would be a little bit better.
Absolutely. So in nutrition, this is kind of slightly off topic to the paper, but there is a problem in nutrition that I'm sure you're well aware of, Dustin, is that we can't randomize people to be on a diet for 40 years and then see who died from cardiovascular disease, who didn't. We can't. It's not feasible. I mean, it's not ethical probably, and it would cost too much. You'd probably end up, there'd be so much people who left the study that it would be a really biased sample by the end. So those who actually stuck with it wouldn't be representative of the general population anyway. So because nutrition science is not able to do that, the prospective cohort studies, where you follow people up for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and you intermittently assess their diet and their blood markers and all this different stuff, and then you see who dies from whatever cause, and then you draw that correlation. That's the benefit of the prospective cohort studies. And in nutrition science, they're really the only way that we can assess these long-term outcomes. So how does this diet influence the risk of cancer? We can't do that with a randomized trial. At least, well, sometimes you can. For example, with the Mediterranean diet and cardiovascular disease, there have been some randomized controlled trials, but they're limited to being conducted with people who have the disease. So they're at higher risk of dying within the next 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years. So you can do it on that scale, but even then, the resources that go into those trials, it's so much money that it's very, very difficult to get funded for a study like that. So we're generally looking at these prospective cohort studies.
Got it. Yeah, so we've talked about the healthy and the unhealthy plant-based indices. So let's go into a little bit for the people who are interested in, like, okay, what do I eat? What was that? Did you guys see that?
Yeah. Celebrations.
Celebrations. Okay.
Wait a
Anywho.
minute. I was just starting to get serious. I'd even formulated an intelligent question for Patrick, and then the stinking balloons.
The balloons
I'm
came
out.
up.
I'm out.
All right.
Wow.
Yeah, so let's talk about, for the people who are interested in, okay, what do I eat? What was involved in figuring out what a healthy plant-based diet is and what an unhealthy plant-based diet is. And then I brought up the supplemental table that you have linked in that paper. And so if you want to give a broad overview of what healthy and unhealthy are, and then I have some highlighted things on the screen here that I want to ask about.
Yep. So you'll notice that in the actual paper, when I introduce the terms healthy, unhealthy, I have them in quotations because it lacks nuance, that those words, but it's just a way to class them. You could say more healthy, less healthy as well, but it's just a way to class them. So obviously not all these foods are necessarily healthy in every context or unhealthy in every context. So just to get that out of the way. This was based on the Harvard group, on the way they classified foods as healthy or unhealthy, and obviously the animal foods. So in the healthy food groups, we had whole grains, fruits. You can see there obviously all the different subtypes, vegetables, nuts, legumes, such as beans, lentils, that sort of thing, and then vegetable oils, as well as tea and coffee. And then the unhealthy plant foods were classed as fruit juices, refined grains, potatoes, sugar sweetened beverages, and sweets and desserts. And when we were constructing and then the animal foods they're just separate because in every index they're actually reverse scored. So essentially what this means is that if people were eating more of these healthy plant foods, they kind of scored higher in that healthy plant-based diet index, and vice versa with the others. What we did was we got the quantity, so the amount of grams that the people ate of all these different food groups, and then we put them into quintiles. So those who are in the highest quintile, which is in the top 20% relative to everyone else, they got a score of 5. Those who are in the next quintile below the first, but above the third, in the kind of 60 to 80% of the whole cohort, they were scored 4, and then 3, and then 2, and then 1, all the way down to the lowest quintile. And then that was scored 5 for the healthy plant foods. It was in that direction. And that's what you can see here, positive scores on the right-hand side of the table for the PDI and the HPDI. And then for the UPDI, which is the unhealthful one, these healthy foods are actually scored the opposite way. So what that means is those who ate the most, they got 1 point, and then all the way down to 5 points for the least. So it's actually just flipping the way it's scored. And then for the unhealthy plant foods, it's the same but the opposite way. So for the HPDI, the healthy plant-based diet index, again, those who are in the highest intake for, let's say, refined grains, they were given a score of 1. Whereas for the unhealthy plant-based diet index, they were given a score of 5. So when you do all that, and then the animal foods were scored for every in the say, the animal foods were scored as, if they were eating a lot of them, they were scored as 1, and then those in the lowest quintile were scored as 5. So when you add all that together, theoretically speaking, the lowest score you can have is 18, and the highest score is 90. You'll notice in our paper the highest score is 86, and that's only because people didn't really eat much nuts and sugar sweetened beverages. And when you're doing this, the quintiles, it wouldn't compute quintiles. We had to do quartiles and then tertiles, which means you drop the top score by 4 points. But that's beside the point. And that's how we made the scores. And to give people insight, then obviously you can see here in the table that all of the food items that are listed, they're all the food items that were in the questionnaire. So in the food frequency questionnaire, you're asked a question: how often do you eat brown bread? And then it says never. It says, once a month. It says once every 2 to 4 weeks, once every week, 2 to 3 times a week. It goes all the way up to about, I think it's multiple servings a day, maybe 3 servings a day. So people tick the box that best suits what they think they eat, right? And it just, you do food item by food item. But because, you want the people to be able to fill this out, but you don't want them to be there for ages, because they'll just, they won't fill it out then. So you need to balance getting the information you want with the time constraint and the kind of participant burden. So generally you want to keep it to about 150 items or less. So this particular one, I think, is about, it's about 150 items, if I could remember correctly. And that's why sometimes you have to collapse foods into one food. So for example, soy meat, the one you have highlighted there, that's just like one variable that could indicate tofu, could indicate vegetable burgers that might be less soy. Do you know what I mean? So you're getting an idea of diet, but you're not getting like super accurate level of diet. But you can still classify people as more or less. You just don't know if that more or less is necessarily exactly true to what they actually eat on an everyday basis, if that makes sense.
What was
got it.
What was the modification you did for the Irish population?
Oh yes. So in the Harvard study where they first made this score and they validated the score, what they at that time, it was the nurses' health study, 1 and 2, and the health professionals follow-up study. They started back in the 80s. So at that time, margarines contained trans fats.
Oh yeah.
So what they did was, because margarines, they didn't know, but they're high in unsaturated fats, which are heart healthy, right? But because they had trans fats in them, people who ate them actually didn't realize they were getting this kind of very deleterious fat for their health. So because of that, they didn't even include that in the score. They just didn't include it, and then they adjusted for it in the statistical model, which basically means that they tried to get rid of the effect that those eating margarines would have on any outcome, and just to hold that constant. So to kind of exclude it from what you're trying to look at. But for us, this study was published, or sorry, the study itself, the participants were gathered in 2010, and in that time in Ireland, there's basically no trans fats in the food supply. So
wow,
the margarines that people eat in 2010 would be high in unsaturated fat. So they would definitely have an association with some of the markers we were looking at, particularly LDL, ApoB.
Right.
Unsaturated fats tend to lower ApoB and LDL. So if we didn't include that, you're losing on some of the, that's quite a component of people's diets. If they're not having butter, they're having margarines, generally speaking. So excluding it just wouldn't make sense. And it was actually it was a reviewer comment when it was in peer review. We actually had originally excluded it just because I just followed the footsteps of the other researchers without really thinking about it. And then that was a comment from one of the reviewers, and then I had to go back and recalculate the scores with that in it. But it was good because it actually made a difference with some of the outcomes. The ApoB outcome, or the non-HDL outcome, became significant actually after adding that into the score for the unhealthful plant-based diet index, which was interesting to see as well. So it definitely had an impact in this study.
Interesting. I'm
That's
glad you
cool.
brought I'm glad you brought up the food frequency questionnaires. So that's another thing that we hear on the internet, is that a lot of these studies like this one, and like the Nurses Health study and NHANES, are based on food frequency questionnaires, and how unreliable those food frequency questionnaires can be. So, but I don't know if I want to get too off track here, because I still have questions about this. But real quickly, how can we be sure that the food frequency questionnaires are reliable enough for us to use?
Yeah, so what researchers do is they validate them, which what that means is they look at how these questionnaires classify people's diets, and then like how much of all the different types of foods that they capture. And then what they do is they compare that with when people are given food diaries. So for example, in Nurses Health study, they take a subgroup of people and they gave them food diaries. So I think it was 7-day food diaries. And they're our gold standard for understanding how people eat, because what they do is every day they actually weigh what they eat. If they're weighed food diaries, or if not, they estimate by portion sizes, but it's perspective. So you're actually each day you're getting up and you're seeing what you're eating, you're logging it. So that's our best way of actually understanding what people eat at a point in time. So what they do is they compare what they find with the questionnaire versus what they find with the gold standard. And then they tend to report, it depends on the food frequency questionnaire, but in the validation studies for the nurses' health study, which was, that Harvard group kind of created the food frequency questionnaire, there was very strong correlations between what you see via the questionnaire and what you see via the food diaries. So I think the correlation coefficients, this might be getting too technical, but they were like, 0.6 and above for most things, which is a strong correlation. And also, I mean, even if it doesn't, exactly map onto what you eat if you're doing a food diary, it's more about, when we're looking at these analyses, we're more looking at differences within the cohort. So if everyone's doing this, and let's say everyone's off by a factor, if they're all kind of off by a similar factor, we can still do the analysis between them, because we're looking at within cohort differences. We're not, so if everyone's off by a certain amount, it still renders the analysis valid. And then also, when we do our analysis, we do a thing called energy adjustment. So because some people underreport, more so than overreport, and you could have a value where someone's like eating, 800, 900 calories a day or even less, and we're like, okay, that doesn't look right. What you can do is you can adjust for energy intake, which means that you're actually doing a comparison independent of calories. So it's on a density basis, kind of. Now, there's different ways to do it, but essentially you're looking at the composition of the diet versus the composition of this diet, not everything in the diet versus everything in this diet. So it's like on a standardized basis. So if, let's say, I eat 1,000 calories and I eat two servings of fruit, and another person eats 2,000 calories and 4 servings of fruit, when you standardize that, you're actually looking at the same composition of fruit in the diet, even though one person ate double the fruit and double the calories. That's the idea behind energy adjustment. So that is, you just have to adjust for energy when you're using FFQs. And ideally, you should probably do it for most things, because people can underreport no matter what. No matter what dietary assessment tool you use. And then also, if you want to, which we did, you can go one step further and actually exclude those who you deem as either underreporting or overreporting. So if there's a real outlier, let's say, or a few outliers, that can skew things sometimes. So you can actually just take them out of the analysis, repeat the analysis, and see if you found the same thing. And when we did that, we excluded men who ate less than 800 calories a day and those who ate more than 4,000 calories a day. And we did the same for females with less than 500 and more than 3,500. And we repeated the analysis, and it's in the supplement, and pretty much every association holds. So it gives us a little bit more confidence that extreme misreporters aren't skewing data.
Got it. So it's not just
Wow.
that you're sending these food frequency questionnaires out and it's asking people if they ate bread once a week, once a month, or whatever. There's actually a validation process to it. And my understanding is there are actually some food frequency questionnaires that are so good we can actually predict changes in biomarkers. Is that correct?
Yes. So the other step of validation is to do biomarkers. So if this food frequency questionnaire classifies me as eating, let's say, a lot of fish, you can then look at the people who say that. You can take their tissue sample and you can see, okay, they have more omega-3, they have more DHA, EPA in their, like, whatever, red blood cell. And that's, the correlation between them, then you draw. And if it's a strong correlation, then it's like, okay, well, they're actually eating the fish. So the food frequency questionnaire did actually capture that intake. So that's done as well. You're absolutely correct with that as well.
Okay, very cool. All right, so back to this list of foods. So I have the soy meat kind of thing highlighted. I'm seeing a lot of debate online these days over these plant-based meat alternatives, and a lot of people are deeming them to be specifically unhealthy just because of the number of ingredients that are in there, or it may contain ingredients that people find hard to pronounce or they don't recognize. So where do you think some of those things like the Beyond Burger, Impossible Meats, stuff like that, where do you think that falls in?
Yeah, I think that if you're comparing, like when you look at foods, you always have to keep in mind kind of three things really. It's probably more, but three things come to mind. The first thing will be, what does the components of that food, what health effects do they have independently, right? So that's like, for example, with fruits and vegetables, they have polyphenols. Polyphenols have independent health effects, no matter what else you eat in the diet. Adding them to diet's a good idea. So that's the kind of first thing. It's like, well, what's the independent health effects of particular food and the components of the food? Second thing will be the dose. So how much of the food are you eating? If let's say you're eating, I don't know, 7, 8 Beyond Burgers a day,
Mm.
or in another scenario, you're eating one every 2, 3 days, that's going to have make some difference on the health outcomes. And then the third thing would be, what are you not eating instead, right? So if you're eating Beyond Burger, if you compare that to eating, I don't know, like a 3 bean chili, right, with vegetables and different things, versus a Beyond Burger in bread, maybe with a little bit of lettuce if you're lucky, you know, there's that opportunity cost there. So it's a hard one to answer. I think it comes down to context, but I think if people, I guess the most natural substitution you would think of would be like a beef burger for a Beyond Burger, or a beef
Hmm.
burger for Impossible Burger. And we have a little bit of research on that. We don't have a huge amount of research on that. Um, Christopher Gardner, so Professor Christopher Gardner from Stanford, he ran a study, the swap meat trial, where he essentially got people who ate meat. I think they ate about maybe 2 or 3 servings a day, and he said, okay, I want you to swap to Beyond products. It was Beyond burgers. It was some of the sausages, I think, and possibly some of the chicken, the Beyond chicken. And what he did was, it was a crossover trial. So for, I think it was 8 weeks, or was it 4 weeks? I think it was 8 weeks. They ate those kind of Beyond products. And then they swapped over and they ate grass-fed organic beef instead, right? And what they found was that in the Beyond group, there wasn't much a difference, to be quite honest, between the two groups in terms of health markers. But there was a modest, a small reduction in LDL cholesterol for the Beyond Meat group, and then they did lose 1 kilo of weight, which, it was a significant finding, but clinically probably not that significant. But it's just interesting to see. And everything else pretty much stayed the same. Like they published another paper looking at, because they looked at inflammatory markers and
Hmm.
a whole bunch of inflammatory markers, and a total inflammatory score, if I'm correct, and essentially nothing really changed there. So, in my opinion, it's a pretty lateral swap with it, with, let's say, beef, and there might be some benefit to LDL because the Beyond products are lower in saturated fat, and that's the main constituent of beef that's going to raise your LDL cholesterol, which in turn raise your heart disease risk. So yeah, I really don't think they're an issue. Um, when we're talking about this particular study, here, this was 2010. This is before a lot of those products actually hit the market.
Hmm.
So the soy meat here is more the kind of the bean burgers, the kind of the more primitive, I guess, editions of these kind of soy burgers that are kind of less, I guess, quote unquote processed,
Mm.
So that's kind of that's why we would have classed it as legumes, because again, this question back then wasn't really, it was saying soy meat. I think the way the question was actually asked, it was like, example tofu, example veggie burger. So the people,
Gotcha.
they saw that's what they thought. Okay, tofu, veggie burger, bean burger, that's probably what they're eating. So that's why we included it in the legume group, because it's probably most likely to be more legume than anything else.
I have a question
Okay.
about that real quick, Patrick. So in that study, in the Stanford study, was there a control as far as, so if you have people who are comfortable and regularly eat like a beef burger, but then they change for an 8 week period to a soy or tofu or a bean based, the primitive, more primitive beast based um, product, was there a control about they were consuming the same amount? Just from my own experience, like when I ate tofu for the first time, it's like Yeah, I'm not eating much of this. It just kind of revolted me. I didn't like it. And so I was just wondering, so in the 1 kilo weight loss over a period of time, were they eating the same amount, same frequency of the
Yeah.
product?
So that particular study was just looking at Beyond. Okay. So it
Okay.
wasn't your kind of bean burger, blah blah blah.
Okay.
It was
Okay.
specifically the kind of new age meat
Okay.
alternatives, right?
Okay. Okay.
So what they and there was the control, they were their own control because it was a crossover study.
Right. Right.
So I believe there was a wash-in period, which is I think there was. Now I kind of might be a bit hazy on that, but
Yeah, there
assuming
was a
there was a
wash in, but
right,
no in
no
between
wash
diet
out. Yeah,
washer. Yeah.
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
So what they did was they ate like everyone ate a standard diet for,
Okay.
let's say the wash-in was a few weeks. I can't remember the exact.
Got it.
Then they ate 8 weeks of the Beyond diet, or half of them ate 8 weeks of the Beyond diet, half of them ate 8 weeks of the organic grass-fed beef diet thing, and then
Right.
they swapped over, and it was matched for servings.
Okay.
So if they're eating three, I think it was three servings in one group,
Right.
then when they went to the other one, they're eating three servings of the other. Now,
Okay.
with
Good.
the 1 kilo weight loss is obviously they lost, or they ate a little bit less calories. That wasn't designed. That just happened. So that's
Okay.
just what happens in the real world potentially. You know, at least in these individuals, when you eat
Right.
the plant products, and it could be there's more fiber in them, and there could be tiny effects there on, I don't know, satiety. It could be anything. I mean, it's only a kilo, so we're not going to hang our hat on that results and
Hmm.
say it's
Right.
amazing.
Right.
But yeah,
Right. 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 Okay. Cool.
Okay. Yeah, all right. So great answer there. Now, in the unhealthy category, we have the potatoes. So we have boiled and baked potatoes and roast potatoes. Now, Dwayne and I just a couple weeks ago discussed the Nordic nutrition recommendations, and they have potatoes as its own category. So to cut to the chase here is like we see in different diets and in different cultures, like potatoes being a staple as part of the diet, and we see less incidence of diabetes and cardiovascular disease and those things. So what specifically was it about the potatoes that made boiled and baked and roast potatoes fit into the unhealthy category versus the healthy category? Whereas like we can understand French fries and crisps or potato chips for Americans and potato salad, we can understand how that could be, but the boiled and baked and like I don't see why that was in the unhealthy.
mm-hmm. uh, First of all, no one eats more potatoes than the Irish.
True.
I would
So
not have said. I would not have said that.
uh, okay, yes, the reason why, and this was actually a reviewer comment, not on my paper, but from another paper from the group. Actually, my girlfriend did my master's with me, and we actually both did papers separately on plant-based diet indices, and she looked at inflammatory markers, and that was published last month, or was it this month? It was published recently as well. Anyway, so she was asked by a reviewer about separating the potatoes, so putting the boiled and baked and the roast, or maybe just the boiled and baked and mashed, into the vegetables group essentially, so they're
Mhm.
scored positively. So it's a good question. The reason why she didn't do it and I didn't do it, is because, first of all, and you rightly mentioned French fries, uh, associations between potato intake, in these kind of long term cohort studies, like the Nurses Health study, like some other studies, and risk of cardiometabolic disease, such as your type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease, they tend to actually associate with increased risk. And then even when you stratify by the type of potato, now there's not a lot of research on this, but I did find a meta-analysis, and there's potentially another one, where, and for anyone who doesn't know, a meta-analysis is a collection of different papers, different findings. You put them together into one finding to increase the certainty of evidence, increase the statistical power to find an effect. So there was a meta-analysis that did look separately between boiled and baked and potentially mashed versus the other types, and they didn't really see. I think they might have saw like a slight increase in risk still, right? So I just didn't see enough evidence to suggest that it warranted going into the vegetable group. And when we're getting down to the food level, we're getting very nitty gritty. I mean, we
Mhm.
obviously potatoes can. I mean, I eat potatoes. I think they can be part of a healthy dietary pattern for sure. But when you're independently looking at foods effects, what you're doing is in those analyses is you tend to adjusting sometimes for other foods, or sometimes you adjust, well, you always adjust for energy intake. And if you're, let's say, again, it comes down to a comparison. If you're going to choose potatoes or vegetables, sometimes in some of these analyses, there are comparisons. They don't tend to do as well than some other kind of healthy plant foods. So that's the reason why I don't have any I don't really have any negative thoughts towards potatoes. But
Yeah.
yeah, and also I mean in Ireland at least, people put butter into potato.
Yes.
So it's hard to disentangle from a food frequency questionnaire how that potato is eaten, even if it's boiled or baked. People put butter on baked potatoes, so and considering that research where you're looking at potatoes and health outcomes, that's from food frequency questionnaire data too. So there is a limitation there with the data, the way we collect it. So I mean, if we just don't have enough data to say explicitly, oh, this type of potato is okay and that one's not. I tend to
Hmm.
think these boiled and baked are better. But even still, at least in the studies that I've saw, they still seem to associate with either a small amount of risk, or don't associate either way. And that's why I kept them in there.
Got it. So it's kind of like not to say that boiled and baked potatoes themselves would necessarily be unhealthy, but the way people actually eat them, the way that the data is collected from the broader population would put them more into that category than the healthy category.
Probably. I
Okay.
will say I'm that's just what I'm like. I don't have anything to back that up with
Yeah.
other than just the
People just,
intuition.
yeah, they're just not eating plain boiled potatoes. They're putting sour cream and butter and cheese and salt and everything on it.
Probably, and again, it's just a question in the questionnaire, so you can't get to the super granular level.
Hmm.
And I will say, like people like Walter Willett, so he is the guy who essentially created food frequency questionnaires. He started that whole nurses' health study back in the day, and obviously he's a big name in nutrition science. And actually, I have his textbook here, Nutritional Epidemiology,
I have
Awesome.
to get
latest
that one.
edition. Yeah, it'll cost you a pretty penny, but it's good.
Most of them
Um,
do.
And he has it
yeah,
by his side. That's amazing.
yeah. But he says, he thinks that the next kind of, I suppose, frontier at looking at like within these kind of food groups like vegetables and that sort of thing that are generally associated with better health, there's probably a level of detail below that. So what if you look at starchy vegetables, or those that are more starchy? So like his intuition, I guess, or his thoughts are that like things like potatoes and peas, like peas in the legume group, are more starchy, less fibrous than other legumes. So maybe that has an effect. Maybe you can get to that level. We're just not there yet.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then just for the listeners out there, so the animal food groups, so we see reverse scores associated with the PDI, the HPDI, and the UPDI. That doesn't necessarily mean that those items are unhealthy. They just don't add to the plant-based diet score. That's what this is saying, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
research question is, how does plant-based diet quality affect the
Right.
associations with lipids and lipoproteins? So to answer that question, we can't include the animal food groups in those scores as a positive score. So yeah, so they're reverse scores. So what we're trying to see is high adherence to the PDI, high adherence to the HPDI, and high adherence to the UPDI. They all have lower intakes of animal foods, but what we're trying to see is the difference between those types of plant-based diets. So is the plant food in that diet that makes our score high? In the PDI, it's all plant foods. In the HPDI, it's just healthy ones. In the UPDI, it's just unhealthy ones. That's what we're trying to see the differences between.
Yeah. So yeah, I just want to clear that up because somebody may look at that and take away from it that the animal foods listed there are unhealthy. What is going on with the balloons?
I'm
Okay.
glad I didn't see it because
We
I was.
have so many technical difficulties. It's unbelievable. Okay. Um, yeah, I think we're kind of getting to the end here. There's a lot of stuff on statistics that I would like to learn about, but I don't think the audience is much interested in it, and I want to be uh, respectful of everybody's time here. So, Dwayne, did you have anything
No,
else that
the
you wanted to?
first of all, Patrick, you've blown me away. I I'm blown away. You guys have done an amazing job. So I was just wanting to recap on the potato thing. So just for the as the average man ombudsman. So basically on the potato thing, if I could recap that, it's really just so presentation wise, and until you go to a granular level, potatoes just tend to be included as an unhealthy thing, mostly because, like I said, presentation. I mean, people slather butter on it and sour cream and blah blah blah, or they ate it in chips, and so unless you go to a granular level, that's why that's in the unhealthy category. Is that
Yeah,
safe
essentially
there?
yes. Like
Okay.
that's my opinion. That's my
Yeah.
takeaway from the research, from how the dietary data is collected,
Yeah.
and that sort of thing, and obviously the previous findings, but
Yeah.
also, when we're looking at, like, the main thing we're looking at here is dietary pattern.
Right.
So it's hard to go to that individual level and really get too granular. It's more about the pattern, and we can see the pattern.
Right.
We can see that, the diet indices allow for the pattern to emerge, and that's really the focus. And again, that's kind of when it comes down to what people eat and recommendations. That's where we want to get to. We want to get to the pattern level, because within patterns, within a plant-based dietary pattern, there's different ways to eat healthy. There's different ways to eat unhealthy, and then those minutiae, like, should I have a potato or not?
Yeah.
Probably not going
Yeah.
to swing the pendulum too much.
Right. Right.
And I mean, like, in my opinion, like just eating potatoes boiled or whatever with nothing on them, I think it's probably a good thing, especially relative to people's diets currently.
Right.
Like, you know what I mean? Like most people eat these kind of processed, kind of high fat sugar salt foods,
Right. Right.
or eat a lot of, let's say, butter or fatty meats. That could definitely be, a potato could be a positive move there. So it's all about the comparison. And boiled potatoes. There was a paper in 1995, where they gave people foods and they asked, how full does that make you feel 2 hours later? And boiled potatoes were number one,
Mhm.
Yeah.
on that list. So
Yeah.
for people looking to lose weight, I wouldn't. Boiled potatoes seem to be really good for fullness. And then, 2 hours after they ate the potatoes, then they were given a meal to eat, and they ate, like, much less calories
Right.
than when they ate, let's say, a croissant or white
Right.
bread.
Right. Right.
So
Right.
context matters hugely when you get down to the application of the science.
Right. Yeah. 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 Exactly. Got it.
Yeah, Christopher Gardner says compared to what and combined with what.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. That's good.
Yeah. Okay, so getting down to the end of this thing here, I've highlighted in red differences from quintile 1 to quintile 5 of the healthy plant-based diet indices for HDL cholesterol was a plus 8%, triglyceride concentrations minus 8%, and consistent with results from statin therapy are consistent with results from statin therapy and may associate with clinically important reductions in cardiovascular disease. So if I'm understanding this correctly, is that based on the population that you looked at and all of the specific information in regards to that, if someone went from quintile 1 to quintile 5 in the healthy plant-based diet indice, that was kind of equivalent to receiving a statin?
No.
No.
So this is, first of all, we're looking crudely here.
Mm-hmm.
So we're just looking crudely. Okay, what are the levels of people who are in the bottom quintile versus the top quintile? So there's no real statistical analysis going on here. This is like a cherry on top, maybe, like, at the end of it all. It's like, oh, and also XYZ. So what I'm saying here is that the difference between those markers, between the top and the bottom quintiles, in long-term either prospective cohort studies, the Framingham study was cited here, and then in trials where people are given statins, these differences in the marker concentrations are observed, right? So, I think it was Framingham, at least I think that's what I cited there. I can't 100% remember, but I think it was a 2 to 3% reduction in cardiovascular disease risk per, like, 0.026 millimole per liter increment in HDL cholesterol. Now, importantly, that doesn't mean that if I today, improve my HDL by that much, I'm going to have an 8% reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. I'm not making a causal claim here. It's just an association claim. So it could be the case that those people who had the 8% higher HDL cholesterol also had, let's say, lower ApoB. It's just a marker of metabolic health. So all that sentence is just saying that those who eat the more healthy plant-based foods, they look like a healthier phenotype, a healthier population versus those that eat less. And their differences in these markers could associate with a reduced risk. It's not a causal claim. That's as far as you can go with that sort of statement.
Okay. I'm seeing that. Okay. All right. Very good. Yeah, I think that about wraps up for me. Dwayne, you good?
I'm good.
Yeah, Patrick, this was fantastic. I'm glad you came on. I'm glad that we were able to ask you questions about this and you were able to explain a lot of things that people may take away incorrectly from this. So appreciate it very much.
That's
I have one more
guys.
question. I have one more question.
Go ahead.
Hey, when can Patrick come back?
Very good. Well, we'll have to wait for the next
Yeah.
paper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, thanks, guys. I really appreciate it. It's nice to have a platform to talk about this stuff because it occupied 1.5 years of my life. These things take time, and it's nice to have an audience that wants to listen to it. And then I guess we're talking very sciencey here. A lot of what we got into was specifics of methodology, and more on the, I suppose, academic side. But on the kind of practical takeaway, I guess it would be to eat, to be mindful if you are eating a more plant-based diet, and you could be doing that for your own health, you could be doing it for environmental reasons, you could be doing it for animal ethics reasons, whatever the reason is, it's worth, weighting your dietary pattern towards those healthy plant foods, that you can see in the first table from the supplement, and these eating that sort of way and not eating those other unhealthy plant foods can have some improvements in your markers. And probably the most important will be the ApoB concentration, which when you go to your doctor and you get your LDL cholesterol, that kind of would be the best marker, or the non-HDL cholesterol, of tracking ApoB. So if you make the change and you see your ApoB goes up or your LDL cholesterol goes up, then maybe your plant-based diet isn't on the healthy side, and that's definitely something to have a look at. So the takeaway would be to load up on fruits and vegetables. No one eats enough of them. Plant-based fats, your nuts and seeds, your vegetable oils, even though people say seed oils will kill you. I think you guys did an episode on that, as far as I'm aware.
We did.
Yeah. So don't worry about that. And then your whole grains, no one eats whole grains. All these kind of stuff that's boring and we hear all the time. And it's consistent advice from years and years and years. And it only incrementally changes because there's an evidence base there that's quite big. And to topple that over, you really have to have a very strong evidence. To date, we haven't been able to topple that kind of healthy dietary pattern. So that's the practical takeaways. If anyone's listening and how can I implement this kind of into my life, they'd be my 3 things would be more fruits and vegetables, more plant fats, and then your whole grains. And of course, if you're going to be really good, add some legumes, some beans, lentils, swap it out for some red meat potentially, and you're good to go.
Awesome.
That's awesome. Wow. That's great.
Good. All right, Patrick, where can people find you?
I am on Instagram at just.health.info. I also write, as you mentioned in the introduction, I write articles for Training 1-to-1. So that's a supplemental, actually, soccer. So football, we call it soccer, you guys call it football coaching company in Ireland. So I write stuff online about nutrition science, about sports nutrition, about exercise science. Essentially, we're just trying to give some information to the average person and the athlete to also improve their health as well as their sports performance. So training1to1.com/blog. If you go to there, you can see all our articles. We have about 50 of them to date. And you can actually put your email in at the top into our mailing list, and you get a notification every time we post a new one, which is generally speaking every week. Otherwise, I'm on Twitter at Patrick Elliott 0, or X as it's called now. And that's pretty much where I tend to hang around online.
There might be an opportunity. There might be an opportunity in the future, Dustin, where we want to bring him back about some strength training.
Oh yeah, for sure, definitely. Yeah, sports related stuff, because I'm trying trying to get a little bit away from the powerlifting side and a little more into the cardiorespiratory thing for my own health. So yeah, we'll definitely have to have you back on and talk about that. So Patrick, my question for my guests, my one question here, if you had one piece of advice to offer people that's not related to nutrition or exercise that would better their lives, what would that be?
Get out into nature.
Yeah.
Get out of that. And I have to say it to myself, because I work a lot. I spend most of my day in front of a laptop or a screen, or either, traveling to and from work or whatever. Get out into nature and switch off the phone and just be present and, just enjoy yourself.
Wow, that's great. That's awesome.
Good advice.
That
All
is.
right. As always, I hope somebody took something away from this. Dwayne, I know your mind was blown. Mine was too.
Completely.
So we will see everybody next time. Lamby out.